Coming up next, Think Again TV interviews William B. Davis, aka the cigarette-smoking man from the hit show The X-Files. Can one of science fiction's greatest alien abduction conspiracy-running villains also promote atheism and skepticism?
We can give it to him.
Think Again TV is produced by Centre for Inquiry, Canada's premier venue for secular humanists, atheists, skeptics, and free thinkers.
Is it the case? I know you've given talks to skeptic organizations. Do you want to just tell us a bit about, I guess, what that's like? I think you've actually given talks to some of our CFI branches as well over the years.
Yes, I think so. And they've covered a range of subjects. They came up originally, or the connection came originally because while I was on X-Files, I kept encountering people who thought that I was on X-Files because I chose to be part of this show that was about paranormal and alien abductions, and they assumed not only that I was interested in these things, but that I actually believed in them. And finally, I had to say, after one more person came up to me and said they wanted to take me on a skywalk to look at UFOs, or they wanted to show me new evidence about Area 51. They went, no, I don't actually believe in these things. And to which they were totally surprised and said, but why not? To which I replied, well, the onus is on you to prove that they exist, not me to prove that they don't. I can't prove that aliens don't exist any more than I can prove that fairies don't exist or leprechauns. But we have proved that they exist, they said. And at that point I was stopped because I didn't know what their proof had been.
Right.
I hoped to find out, and I happened to listen to a radio interview with the late Barry Beierstein. And he was talking about PSYCOP, which is what the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry was then called, the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal. And they were doing exactly what I needed to know. They were looking at the proofs of these paranormal things, or the so-called proofs, and subjecting them to scientific scrutiny. So I tracked Barry down. We had a wonderful lunch. We became very good friends. He introduced me to PSYCOP and to CFI and the whole organization. And I thought, wow, this is fantastic. And that's how I got connected. So then I found myself doing X-File conventions and so on. And as the talks would all move on to these kind of subjects, do these things really exist? What should we think about them? And so on. And gradually my kind of reputation as a skeptic grew, and I started to speak to college groups and various other organizations.
So it was really through the X-Files connection that people sort of saw you as, I guess at first, ironically, spokesperson for the paranormal or the alien abduction movement, and then you kind of flipped it on them and you became a spokesperson for skepticism and critical thinking.
Exactly. As I write in my book about this strange debate that I was asked to moderate between John Mack, who was the big alien abduction person, on the one side, and on the other side there was someone who believed in aliens among us, but not in abductions. And I was supposed to moderate the middle ground between these two positions.
So that was kind of the turning point for you at that particular event?
No, I was well turned by then. It was just extraordinary that I actually got, in a way, to meet the guru of that world, and it was very interesting because, I'm an actor, and one of the reasons he so believed that people were being abducted by aliens was the emotional truth with which what did he call them? The abductees. He had another name, I think, expressed themselves, that their emotions were so real that the experience must be real. And of course, as an actor, I'm very experienced with not only me, but others having real emotions in imagined circumstances. That's what we do as actors.
Yeah, I'd like to go maybe a bit into the history that you take us through in your book, Musings of a Cigarette-Smoking Man. And in particular, when you were talking earlier about that issue of who has, the burden of proof to present evidence for a claim, I recall a story you tell back, I think it was in high school, when you had a teacher who just assumed everybody in the class was a Christian of some kind. And you actually confronted him, and I think this was your kind of your public coming out as an atheist. And I think you also talk a bit about, the burden of evidence, in this case for God belief. What sparked you with that particular moment in time to suddenly just sort of declare this?
Well, it happened really kind of accidentally. It wasn't really a plan. What happened was that the teacher, who was a little bit, and I talk about this in the book too, because we made fun of him, and I don't think we should have, because he was a product of World War II. He had a plate in his head, and of course he wasn't quite normal. But at any rate, he was in the front of the class. He said he was trying to trick us into knowing when the Reformation was, and so he said something like, "So, if you'd all been living in the 14th century, you'd all have been Catholics, right? Right? Is that right?" So most people had some vague idea. So is there anybody here who wouldn't have been a Catholic in the, I think he said 14th century, I can't remember, no, 14th centuries. So, well, I don't think under any circumstances I'd be a Catholic, I thought to myself. So I raised my hand rather timidly. And he said, yeah, come up here. And he pulled me up to the front of the room, stood me beside his desk, and he said, well, you know that all Christians in the 13th or 14th, whatever, the century were Catholic. Yes? And I said, okay, yes, all right. And you wouldn't have been a Catholic? I said, I don't think so, sir. And he said, well, aren't you a Christian? This was a rural Ontario school in the 50s. Right. No Jews or Muslims or Hindus. We were all supposed to be Christian. Right? And I said, aren't you a Christian? So I said, well, what do you mean by Christian, sir? Well, that got him. His mouth was foaming. Well, someone who follows the teachings of Christ, he said. And I said, well, you'd better count me out. And I went back and sat down. And so it wasn't a determined plan to come out and be public, but I was kind of forced into it. And
what was the fallout from that, from the teacher, but also from your peers?
Oh, from the peers, it was amazing, especially the women, the girls. I mean, I guess at the time, they were all really worried that hadn't I not been saved, and wasn't I afraid I would go to hell? And they were very concerned about my immortal soul.
So even if this kind of coming out, maybe that's not the right way to put it, because it just happened so naturally. Even if that just sort of was a spur of the moment thing, was it something you had been thinking about to yourself? The questions about belief in God and religion leading up to that?
Oh yes, no, I thought a lot about whether there was a God, and it's interesting. My mother was certainly an agnostic, if not an atheist, and we'd had conversations, and it's interesting because the argument that she presented that convinced me at the time, which has since been proven questionable, which was that living on the earth as we do on this planet, everything has a beginning and an end. And her supposition was that it doesn't necessarily follow from that the universe would have a beginning and an end. It could be timeless. There could be no sense of time. And we should briefly tell the story because your viewers might like this story of my arrival at the University of Toronto. Mm-hmm. In following along from my high school experience, because I was nervous about going and living in residence and living away from home and all of those things, as one is. And I was only a few days into university when I was walking through the vestibule of our residence, which went beside the common room, and you went through that to get to your room. And there were some senior students sitting in the common room, and one of them yelled out to me, hey, you! Uh-oh, I thought. He said, do you believe in God? I said, no. He said, well, come on in.
A little different reception than the teacher that you had to deal with in high school.
Totally different. All of a sudden, I was accepted. I was part of the group. We were all free thinkers, and so that was a big change. So I went to university in Toronto. Then after that, I went to Britain. I trained at a British theatre school. Worked in Britain for several years. Came back to Montreal to the National Theatre School of Canada. Then went to Lennoxville, Quebec, and ran a theatre company and part of a drama department there for a few years. Then back to Toronto, in Toronto for a few years, and then out to Vancouver in 1985, which has been my base since then.
And you're still there now. When you, so I'm curious to ask you about how you got interested in and then finally got your foot in the door with the X-Files. And my understanding is that too was similarly organic. You tried out for a gig. You didn't really know if it would lead to anything. Were you hoping it would? Did you sort of see that there was a potential in the X-Files?
No, not at all. And I hardly gave it a thought. I had founded my own theatre school in Vancouver, the William David Centre for Actor Study. My primary activity really was teaching, although I was doing a fair amount of acting with projects that came into Vancouver, but not thinking a lot about them. I still put my career down as acting teacher / actor, I suppose. So what happened? The process simply was, your agent would give you a call and say, they want you to audition for such and such a project, and you'd go and you'd look at the sides and you'd do your best with the sides and then forget about it. And then if they wanted you, they'd call you and you do the job and you'd get paid, and that would be good for your bank account and for your resume usually. So there was no kind of searching out of this show from my end. It was just a show that came in and asked me to audition. So I did, and I auditioned for this part called the senior FBI agent who had 3 lines. Didn't get that part. I got this part with no lines. No, it's gig. Who cares? Stand around in the background smoking, and I get paid. So first of all,
right, because at the time it wasn't clear to you or potentially even the writers what would happen to this character, how that character would develop into such a central villain role.
Exactly. There was no thought, and certainly none expressed to me at any rate, of what might happen to the character. This was just a pilot. So we do lots of pilots. Not many of them are picked up. Rarely are they picked up. So, and I thought, a pilot about the paranormal and alien abduction, I don't think so,
One thing I've heard you say, and this always struck me, because it proves how complicated the show was and how it really dealt with issues of belief and skepticism in a pretty mature and nuanced way, is that you've often defended the smoking man as the hero. And you've suggested that maybe Mulder was actually the kind of the bad guy. Can you explain how you come to that?
Well, it's got to be a starting point for any actor. Is you've got to believe in the character that you're playing, and the character that you're playing, if he's a villain, almost never thinks that he's a villain. I'm sure Hitler didn't think he was a villain. I'm sure Stalin didn't think he was a villain. So why would the cigarette smoking man think that he was a villain? Mm-hmm. He would think that he was doing what had to be done in the circumstances. And basically the circumstances, as it finally sort of fleshed out, that he seemed to find himself in, was that he knew that the aliens were going to invade. They were going to colonize the planet. And so there were really 2 options. You could make the deal with them. You could make a deal with them and make the best of it that was possible, which was what he decided to do. Or you could be like Mulder and just fight everything and probably get destroyed. So Mulder, in the view of the smoking man, was working against the interests of the population at large, and certainly against the interests of the people that I cared about. So Mulder was in the way, and Mulder was not doing anything that was going to be useful or helpful in the circumstances that we found ourselves. But this is the backstory I had to have, and I had fun with it at conventions, trying to convince people that Mulder was the bad guy. But of course, if you take a broader perspective, Smoking Man was like Marshal Pétain and the Vichy government in France in World War II, making a deal with Hitler, and Mulder was really the resistance that actually finally helped to overthrow Hitler. So history has kinder words for Mulder than the Smoking Man.
Now, you're a skeptic, an atheist. Here you are almost falling into a role where you are this great arch villain who is coordinating in some fashion a paranormal alien abduction based conspiracy. So they're rolling all of these kind of pseudoscientific things together. And you talk a lot about how you kind of came to terms with that, that apparent inconsistency. Can you summarize that a little bit for us?
Yeah, it's a tricky question because, as I write in my book, Richard Dawkins was actually campaigning against the X-Files. He actually gave speeches in which he condemned the show for encouraging pseudoscientific thought.
How do we account for the current paranormal vogue in the popular media? It may be an attempt to cash in on the success of the X-Files. This is fiction, and therefore defensible as pure entertainment. A fair defense, you might think. But soap operas, cop series and the like are justly criticized if, week after week, they ram home the same prejudice or bias. Each week, the X-Files poses a mystery and offers two rival kinds of explanation, the rational theory and the paranormal theory. And week after week, the rational explanation loses. But it is only fiction, a bit of fun. Why get so hot under the collar? Imagine a crime series in which every week there is a white suspect and a black suspect. And every week, lo and behold, the black one turns out to have done it. Unpardonable, of course. And my point is that you could not defend it by saying, but it's only fiction, only entertainment.
Richard Dawkins was my hero. The selfish gene changed my life. I had read every word this man had written. And here I was on the verge of a breakthrough in my career, doing a show that he was condemning. So I suppose, if I'd been Mulder, I would have quit the show and I would have joined him on the picket line fighting against the X-Files. But no, I was more like Smoking Man, found a way to compromise. But the truth is, he didn't have any evidence. His case was that each week the show presents a problem or an issue, and each week there is a proposed solution, one that's paranormal and one that's rational. And the paranormal one always wins. And his point was that this was going to encourage people to believe in the paranormal. And he could be right, but he presented no evidence to say that he was right. And he's a man who normally is a big stickler for evidence, as you probably know. So I found that strange, especially when you looked at the show as well, because in each episode there was an issue, and in each issue there was a solution proposed, one by a man and one by a woman. And always the one by the man was right and not the one by the woman, which should have provoked an outcry from the feminists, but it did not. In fact, the feminists got really behind Scully and really liked her. So his argument didn't really seem to hold up. And I would go to conventions and I would ask the people there. I said, how many of you believe that there are aliens among us or aliens abducting people? And the number of hands that went up was, according to the polls that I had read, representative of the proportion of the population at large. So there seemed from this little bit of evidence that I had, but it was a little bit more than he had, that there was no greater belief in the paranormal among X-File fans than there was among the normal population, which would say that his argument was actually inaccurate and invalid and unsubstantiated. So, comforting myself with this thought, I went on and had my career on the X-Files.
Interesting. I want to pick up on what you mentioned about Scully because, I've been thinking that even though her skepticism loses, the show is good about portraying skepticism as something important, as a worthy way of looking at claims, especially extraordinary ones. So at the end of the day, I mean, it did, in a sense, almost glamorize the Scully skeptic character. And certainly, as you just said, she was beloved, certainly by feminists, but I think by most viewers, as a really pivotal character, as much as Mulder. So at the end of the day, do you think the show might have actually, in a weird kind of ironic way, pushed skepticism?
It might have. I had another picture when I write about this in the book. When I went back to do the book, and I looked at a lot of the episodes. So what bothered me in retrospect wasn't the issues that they fought about and that argued about, because that was a fictional story, and as you say, it brought up and gave some credibility to the skeptical argument and brought it to the surface where it could be actually examined. But there were underlying assumptions that were never examined and never challenged. One example, for instance, was that one of the issues that was being discussed was the information was being revealed to Scully through hypnotic regression.
Right.
So there was no question, is hypnotic regression valid? It was just a given that hypnotic regression is a way to find the truth. And we know now, I think, or at least most skeptics know, that that's not so, or that's a very, very doubtful notion. There's another one where, Mulder was very ill and modern medicine couldn't help him. So he went to a healing ceremony, which went on and on and on.
We put 4 oak twigs on the beams of the Hogan to summon the holy people and tell them that a ceremony will be held. It is called the Blessing Way chant. Only the holy people can save the FBI man's life now. He is in their hands.
And brought him back to life. And there was never any question, is this alternative medicine, if you want to call it that, actually better than Western medicine? It was just assumed that it was. It wasn't questioned. It was just laid in there. And I found those kind of things worrying, almost more than the ones that were actually looked at and talked about on the surface.
I want to ask you what you think about, because you've had such a varied career in television and theater and plays and all of that, and you've seen it evolve, all those different media. What do you think about the new rage for paranormal shows? There are a dime a dozen now on television. I want to also ask you, because you talk in your book about postmodernism and how, these days realities are seen as kind of fluid constructs. So do you think that there are certain media that are more easily, in a sense, taken advantage of by that kind of postmodernist way of thinking? Some media like television that are more likely to be taken on by the paranormal communities. And you see, as I said, all these paranormal shows, because you don't really see a lot of theater or plays or musicals that deal with paranormal themes so much.
No, that's true.
I'm not sure why.
Yeah. No, that's true. That's true. It's a good point. And I don't know, because I don't know, and maybe I don't watch enough of them now, but what it seems to be now, though, is where the X-Files actually questioned these things and kind of lived on a kind of cusp of what's real and what isn't. That most of the paranormal shows now just assume it's real. It's like, it's a fiction, and there actually are vampires, or there actually are aliens, or there actually are whatever. And it's just accepted as a fictional framework in which to create a story. Whether it's paranormal or whether, or science fiction. So I don't know whether it's postmodern or whether it's just another way of, just another fashion in storytelling. I'm not sure. I think there might be something more to it, in the sense that the more we build our stories around unlikely things, the less we have to face the likely dangers that we're actually confronting.
We've talked a lot about why people believe in weird things, but I also want to talk a bit about disbelief. I mean, you just brought that up. So you talk a bit in your book about people disbelieving in evolution and climate change. And I'm wondering if there is a reverse problem here of sort of misplaced skepticism, or not, people applying skepticism without the science to lay the foundation of it. It's interesting. We see skepticism as something respectable, but it's kind of overused and it's misapplied when the science is removed from it. And I know you speak out about these kinds of things. How do we deal with this reverse skepticism problem?
Yeah, I worry about it, and I've always, to be honest, been a little bit doubtful about the name skeptical. And when SciComm changed it to CSI, I noticed when I was at the last at SciComm, and most of the people there actually were thinking the S stood for scientific, that it was the Committee for Scientific Inquiry, not the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. And I think that would be a better name, because skepticism does indeed suggest, unless you really have a historical sense of skeptic in a Greek sense, it does to the layperson, I think, suggest doubting things. We just doubt things, and we just so you're right. You can end up doubting things that are well proven, and those of us who buy into the science of climate change, we're somehow just sort of religious fanatics, and the real skeptics question those arguments for climate change in particular, and evolution as well, although that gets really silly. But climate change is it's more dangerous that it's questioned, because then we're not doing anything about it. I don't think it was Rumsfeld. I think it was it Cheney? One of them said, if there's the slightest danger that there is a terrorist potential in Iraq, I can't remember exactly how they phrased it, or the slightest danger that they might have an atomic weapon, I can't remember exactly, but if there was any danger, then we have to act. We have to act because we can't take the risk. But the same thinking doesn't apply to climate change, because even if you doubt it, there's still a danger that the scientists, 95% of them, or is it 97%, think it's true. So you've got to admit there's a possibility, if you're a Republican nominee for president, or if you're the Prime Minister of Canada, surely you have to allow that there's a possibility that climate change is a real danger. And if we believe that, then it's prudent to take some action, and we're taking none. That's crazy.
Is this, speaking out about like climate change and evolution and promoting critical, skeptical, or scientific, maybe if you prefer that term, thinking, is this something that you're looking to move your career into?
If a certain amount of celebrity status that I have allows me to communicate and speak more clearly on these subjects, then I will.
Think Again TV is produced by Centre for Inquiry, Canada's premier venue for secular humanists, atheists, skeptics, and free thinkers.
CFI Canada coordinates branches and campus groups across the country, runs a public education series, provides secular community services, incorporates cutting-edge multimedia such as blogs, podcasts, and YouTube, and is a regular voice in the press presenting a secular humanist, atheist, and skeptical perspective.